Well, welcome to Authors at Drucker. I'm your host, Dave Specht, and I serve as the director of the Drucker School's Global Family Business Institute. Our mission is to be a global gathering place for the world's most influential business owning families. And today's author and the business owning family we'll learn about definitely demonstrates our progress in this direction. Authors at Drucker is made possible by the generous gift from the James E. Hughes Foundation. The foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to advancing the field of family governance and generational well-being. Jay Hughes is actually going to be joining us on this call as well. So thank you, Jay, and to those in the foundation. Dean Dave Sprott is also joining us on the call today as well. I appreciate his leadership in helping make the Global Family Business Institute possible. Thank you, Dave.
You bet, Dave.
So I wanted to just let you know next month we'll also have another session of Authors at Drucker with Jim Grubman. That'll be on November 17th. So if you'll mark your calendars now, that would be great. We'd love to have you. And here are the others that are coming up. Amy Hart Klein in December and Chad Ford in January. We have a couple of programs that we're really excited about. One is a certificate in advising family enterprises that just launched in September. This is for, again, for organizations that have advisors to family businesses. So if you have interest in this program, we'd love to hear from you and see if we can bring this program to your organization. And then finally, we have a generational wealth masterclass that's coming soon. This is a course that I put together with Jay Hughes. And if you'd like to learn more about it as it launches, again, please just reach out and we'll keep you informed. Okay. Without any further ado, let's get to our show today. Allison, if you could spotlight Professor Raianu and I, thank you very much. Our author today is Mircea Raianu. Mircea is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's a historian of modern South Asia and global capitalism. He's also the author of Tata, the global corporation that built Indian capitalism. Welcome, Mircea, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Dave, for the invitation, and to Allison for helping everything run smoothly, and to everyone at Drucker and all of you for having me.
Appreciate you being here. I have to tell you, it's been just a fascinating read for me, and I'm excited to learn from you. So we have a pretty diverse audience here today, people from kind of all over the place, Mircea, and I wouldn't say a lot from India. And so if you could maybe begin with, well, I guess before we even get there, for those that aren't familiar with Tata, Tata's revenues for their company this last year were $128 billion, and they employ 935,000 people, and that's according to their website. So this is a very influential family-controlled business founded by Jamshedji Tata in 1868. We're talking about 30 companies across 10 industry verticals. So again, Tata definitely a household name around the world, but maybe not everyone on the call knows about Tata, but they'll certainly learn about Tata today. So Mircea, if you could give us a little bit of background on just family business in general in India, and then maybe a little bit about how Tata is different.
Sure, and I'll say one interesting thing about Tata that might motivate people to check them out is, you mentioned how long they've been around, 1868, and throughout most of that time period, they have been one of the largest and most influential business groups in India, and they've been really identified with the growth and development of modern India as a nation and its economy for a large portion of that 150 years, and they're still at the top of the world's second largest country by population, and one of the rising growth stars of the last couple of decades. So I think that in that sense, Tata's story is quite unique, and that really was my motivation in writing the book, in the sense that I didn't think there were many other global family businesses with this kind of longevity as well as reach and influence all in one place. That said, I do think that it's always difficult to say that if you study Tata, you can really understand through them a lot of what else is going on in India's business landscape, because the Tatas are in some ways unique. One aspect of family business that is important to note is that among many South Asian communities, not just in India, but also in neighboring countries and throughout the broader region, wealth has been held not just in nuclear families, but in extended families and extended community networks for hundreds of years. So in the case of, for example, the Hindu religion, we have an institution called the Hindu undivided family, which is essentially a large joint family made up of numerous layers of relatives joined by marriage, and the wealth is oftentimes pooled and shared and divided across a very large number of family members. Now, some of these arrangements are enshrined in law in different countries. Others are more informal, or they go kind of around the law. But the constant here is that community, as well as family and various social relationships between people, are very important in the management of cross-generational business. And for, historians and economists have talked about there's reasons why that's the case, because before modern legal systems and modern markets were developed, it was very hard to access capital. It was very hard to know who to trust and how to conduct business across great distances with a lot of uncertainty and risk. And so family and community relationships help to mitigate that risk. What makes Tata stand out is that they come, first of all, from a small minority community called the Parsis, or Indian Zoroastrians. They had come from Persia in the Middle Ages, but had been settled in India for several hundreds of years and had made lots of money, in particular in trade across the Indian Ocean in goods like cotton, opium, silk, and other commodities. But this is a fairly small community. It is a very tight-knit community where those relationships that I mentioned are important. But in the case of the Tatas, their family networks are actually quite small. And because of the scale of the businesses that they were involved in from the late 19th century into the early 20th century, they had to go beyond immediate or even extended family from a very early phase. So they are kind of the pioneers of professional, managerial, corporate style of running their businesses from a very early date. That's not to say that, as I show in the book, family is not important, because it definitely is. But I think the Tatas kind of stand out because they achieved a slightly different balance between employing outsiders and professionalization and training and relying on family members.
Fantastic. So again, they started in shipping. Can you give kind of a sense for how organizationally they evolved, and maybe some of the kind of inflection points where they took on, I guess, made big bets into new industries, because they didn't just stay in shipping, clearly.
So basically, in the early days, we're talking about that late 1800s, mid to late 1800s. Basically, these are fairly small partnerships. A father and some sons, a father and an uncle and sons and nephews. And they mostly get together and they trade in items, like I said, like cotton, and significantly, must be said, in opium as a commodity that is being shipped from India to China. But cotton also being traded. This is at the time of the US Civil War, when there was a global cotton shortage because of the blockade, and Indian merchants kind of step up to bring cotton from India to the factories in England. But anyway, these as the Tatas mature, they get into more bigger investments. They take this capital and they make big plays, in particular in manufacturing. So they are one of the first to start textile mills that actually make finished products in India rather than shipping out raw materials that can't quite compete with British products, but are getting there and definitely trying to seize a lot more market share in India and in other parts of Asia. And then they get into the really big moment of break is when they decide to start a steel plant in 1907. And this is the first time Indians had ever pooled the necessary capital and expertise to pull off something like this. And they're trying to follow in the footsteps of England and the US in terms of the Industrial Revolution and getting into the sector that was really considered to be important at that time, which was industrial manufacture of metals in particular. And then they go on to pioneer all sorts of industries, the chemicals industry, the automobile industry, and the aviation, both for mail and passengers in the 1930s, while maintaining an active presence in textiles. So the organization grows considerably as a result of that. And so you have a situation where you have basically a holding company. This is very common in India, a holding company that is very tightly controlled by members of the family. And that holding company makes investments and then kind of pitches and sets up new businesses in all these sectors. And those businesses have their own boards of directors. They can attract, their own funding, and they're managed by, their own kind of set of talent, but that talent is shared across those companies as needed because of the scarcities that I mentioned. Both capital and talent actually are shared across those companies, all coordinated by this central company, which is called Tata Sons. And they're still around as the central holding company that kind of runs that group.
So one of the things that's a hallmark of long-standing family businesses is, just resilience and the ability to innovate and change. And so as you think about the historical, trajectory of Tata, were there some major inflection points or crisis or conflict that they had to overcome to survive? And were they ever kind of on the brink, or were things ever really in question for them? Maybe you could to speak to that.
Definitely. So I think the history of Tata that I tell in the book is a history of several of these moments. And it's interesting to look at how the family met with and overcame those challenges. I think one of the first ones was the challenge that I mentioned about securing financing and getting that steel plant off the ground. They went to London to get investment from the prevailing capital market at the time. In the city of London were not successful. So they tried to go to New York, were not successful because there was the panic of 1907 on Wall Street that year. And then they had to go back to India to get financing from fellow community members and other kind of wealthy Indian elites that had not been tapped for this purpose before. But in that first couple of decades of the 20th century, you have a much bigger crisis that is going on, which is they are trying to exit those trading sectors that I mentioned. So they have this holding company that's making all these investments into industry, but they still have a bunch of other companies which aren't really part of the main set of companies because they're run again by somewhat distant family members, cousins. These are people who helped them grow and helped them, helped provide the kind of global networks that you needed to attract financing for these industrial investments. But they're still making all their money in trade, in particular and they're based in places like Shanghai and Hong Kong in China, or in Kobe in Japan, and they're very, very distant from what goes on in the headquarters in Bombay in India. So there comes a point where those family members that are running those companies are starting to make a lot of losses. Commodity markets are very volatile. They're very subject to downturns. And a lot of their plans for investment also within India are really badly affected by the global kind of recession or depression or crash that follows after the end of the First World War in 1920. So here's a moment where they can lose a lot of money. They have a problem with their commercial reputation because people think, Tatas have been such wise and far-sighted, business leaders, and now it's looking like their empire is going to fall apart. So they have to make very tough decisions to shed part of their business, and that includes shutting down those trading companies and really reorienting toward the domestic market, toward the Indian market, and toward industry. And that is a long-running dispute. It takes about 10, 15 years until that whole process is kind of cleared out. And the Tatas emerge in a much stronger position at the end of it, but they have sort of given up their kind of global footprint in order to achieve this reorientation. And I think you can trace some other moments of crisis that are very similar and that kind of echo this moment. And we see that even in the early 21st century, when the Tatas kind of, with India's growth, which I mentioned, with India's deeper integration into the globalized world economy, the Tatas came out swinging with very large acquisitions, some of which listeners may know about. They've purchased a Jaguar Land Rover in 2008. They purchased the what was once the British Steel, remnants of the British Steel company, which is now called was then called Chorus in 2007, a huge investment that put the Tatas into a position of being kind of global steelmaking power, and several other big investments, some of which paid off, some of which didn't pay off. So in the past decade, there have been some of the same disputes and concerns about reorienting the group that map onto kind of succession, which I'm sure we will discuss in a moment. So I think that the Tatas seem to have made it through this phase as well. But I would say that that story of resilience over these 150 years is really a story that conceals all these moments where big decisions and big plays were required in order to maintain the viability and success of the group.
One of the principles Peter Drucker taught was that of systematic abandonment. And so when he was working with corporations, he would look at and basically make them look at, what are you going to actively look to stop doing? And so that was kind of the impetus behind the question of, resilience, and were there times when they had to make those really tough calls to stop doing things. And oftentimes I believe it's the stopping of doing certain activities that actually allows for the perpetuation and the long-term success of the business. But those are very tough decisions. I mean, look at Tata, and that's what they were known for, was shipping, and that's how they began and they developed their wealth. And to move away from that must have been difficult on so many different levels.
Absolutely. And I think what's remarkable about the Tatas, and again, quite unique in a lot of ways, is that they haven't shed a lot. So one of the case studies was the one I just mentioned. They definitely got out of trade in that period when many other Indian businesses did not, and suffered as a result. They also did get out of textiles in the 1970s and 80s, and that was a very painful decision, not just because this was kind of where they started 100 years previous. So they started getting rid of the textile mills in around 1977, 79. That was exactly 100 years after they had pioneered getting into this sector. But it was a very tough time for the industry, and they had to make the call to get out. Other than that, though, they have tried to hold on to almost everything they do, even when that is not necessarily, the most competitive, or even where they're not necessarily the most competitive, and even where their success is not assured. They have tried to hold on at many costs. So some of the biggest issues and problems in the history of the group have been in these moments where something doesn't work out and you have to decide to get out. This was the case with that steel investment that I mentioned, which was an investment that ultimately did not pay off because of the post-2008 global downturn. But it was such a kind of high-profile acquisition that raised their that raised their reputation and almost actually stood in for India's newfound place in the world as an economic power. And the Tatas acquiring these big brand Western companies was a really huge symbolic victory for them. So to be able to say, we made a mistake here, maybe we shouldn't have done this, or maybe we should exit, has been very painful, and they are trying to hold on in those sectors. And then sometimes actually they even return to investments they had previously made, as in the case of the most recently acquired, the formerly nationalized flagship carrier of India, Air India, which is a huge acquisition. I'm going to bring them into a lot of debt, and it's a huge task to turn around this, what I think is safe to say was a failing airline. But they are sort of confident that because they were pioneers in this sector, because they are very invested in air travel and have been trying to get back in there, they can do it. But of course, there are many people who think that is perhaps not a wise decision. So I think we can look for many examples in the history of the group where this tension between trying to abandon and then trying to hold on or double down has been going on.
So when we look at some of the business strategy, one of the things that's interesting for me with Tata is that, choosing to do something different in business also has a huge effect on society because of the size and the implications of their workers and the communities that have essentially been built up around these businesses. There's been a lot, it feels like a lot done to kind of codify and to develop a corporate culture and a legacy across generations. And I wanted to see if you would speak to just kind of what their approach was and maybe the evolution of corporate culture with Tata and how they define themselves. Peter Drucker again was talked about how culture eats strategy for breakfast. So talk about company culture for Tata for a minute.
That's a great quote, and I think very applicable to the story of the Tatas. So the first thing I'll say that, just to go back to the previous answer, one of the reasons why they're so reluctant to shed or exit is because for all these years, Tata has developed a very strong brand identity that is in some ways associated with quality, with reliability, and with history. And in an emerging market context like India, where businesses don't tend to survive for, say, more than one generation, or don't tend to, succeed over many decades or centuries in their respective sectors, that really matters. So, if you're a middle-class Indian concerned about, the reliability and the comfort of air travel, then you're going to trust the Tatas to fix that. You're going to trust the Tatas with your computing needs with TCS. You're going to trust the Tatas with your consumer products. You're going to trust the Tatas with the quality of the manufacturing. When you get in a Tata car, you're going to feel safe on the roads, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that has been a huge asset to them. I mean, their brand is their most important asset at this point. But that also comes with, the flip side of, them maybe holding on in some sectors where they maybe shouldn't. Now, the question of corporate culture and how they develop that, how they get to that point where the Tata brand and the Tata name is, everybody kind of knows what it is and what it stands for, is, I think, one of the most important arguments that I try to make in the book. Because I think that a lot of people who kind of look at Tata from the outside in a bit of a superficial way tend to think that has always been there, that this kind of unbroken line of continuity from the founder, Jamshedji Tata, who you mentioned, from the 19th century, and his values and ideas, they see that kind of expressed in the everyday life of the company today without any kind of second thought as to how that happens. So part of what I try to show in the book is, Jamshedji Tata was a 19th century man. He lived a long time ago. We don't have a lot of surviving records from him. He never wrote an autobiography, or a statement of his vision and ideas like Henry Ford or Andrew Carnegie or any business leaders that we can think of from the US that might be parallels to Tata. So we don't have that. We have fragmentary evidence. We have the evidence of what the Tatas did that we can attribute to Jamshedji's quite distinctive personality and set of values. And I'm sure we'll talk about philanthropy in a moment. That was another one of his big passions and big causes of running a business alongside making significant contributions in philanthropy. But to translate those ideas after he passes away and after his sons his two sons, Dorabji and Ratanji, take over the business in the 1910s and 20s, and then into the next generation of leadership, which is quite stable from the 1940s to the 1990s. There was a single chairman. He's known as JRD. And then into that fourth generation in the 90s and beyond, that requires a lot of these things to be, number one, written down, creating what they call the Tata way of doing business, a set of kind of values and codes of conduct. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. And it often is in response to these moments of crisis, or these moments where the identity of the group is under threat. So one of those moments is the 1950s. At this time, the Tatas, India has become independent. The British colonial rulers are gone. They are pretty well entrenched, but they're having some trouble, figuring out where to go next. They're having, to train all these managers in all these different companies. So they create the Tata Management Training Center. They collect their archives, the records of the group as much as they can, and kind of write their own history. And that takes place in 1950. So about 50 to 70 years after the beginnings of the group. And then another moment is in the 90s, when kind of India embarks on liberalizing reforms, globalization is happening, and the Tatas potentially can be exposed to significant competition. They might face another period of risk. And then they have, an extensive series of kind of group-wide culture building initiatives, where they get people together, and it's done through training. It's also done through quality control initiatives run by the main holding company. And it's done through publicly and disseminating their history and talking about their history and their values. And that's basically how you get to where we are today, which is that everybody knows what Tata stands for.
And in terms of your research and pulling this book together, how much of that came from their documentation of their own history, and how much of that came from external sources? I'm just curious.
Yeah, most of it is based on those Tata archives that were collected in the 1950s. And it's interesting, this is a very minor point, but I think I was very surprised pleasantly that the history that they wrote of themselves in 1950 was actually pretty good. It was pretty accurate, pretty well sourced, pretty objective, and they really tried to, understand themselves in a global context, understanding the role they played in that transition from colonial rule, when India was a largely underdeveloped agricultural country, to a modern industrial and economic power. And they understood very well the role they had played, and some of the mistakes they had made, and some of the successes they had had. And for this reason, I'm a little bit disappointed nowadays to see, very kind of thin books on Tata, or stories of Tata that are more like myth. They're more like, that they're not really based on that primary evidence. They're not really based on this kind of balanced and nuanced understanding of how a business group grows and develops over time. They're just they're very reassuring narrative that the Tatas had always gotten everything right, that they always had their values 100% unbroken from the founder, down. And of course, there's a place for those stories. You don't have time to get into all these details all the time. But I was really impressed by how much the Tatas have cared about their history, preserved their history, and want the history to be known to outsiders, including researchers like me, and anybody who wants to visit their archives, which are located in that management training center in the city of Pune, which also has a very nice kind of museum and a kind of exhibition space and public engagement space. And that's very rare in India, once again, where a lot of business groups keep their records and keep their kind of internal workings very close to the chest. So the Tatas are very
Yeah.
different. They want to go out there in the world. They want to make their story known, and they want to kind of establish themselves as this very important organization in the history of India, not just another business. And so
Yeah.
for me, that
Well,
was very interesting and important.
I was going to say, this to me is an important point. I mean, Tata's enormous, but even for the smallest of family businesses, as they try to perpetuate themselves generation to generation, I feel like the historical context of where have we been, what have been the struggles, what have we overcome, those need to be, they need to be documented, they need to be communicated. And then as families get to levels of success, the history then grounds them in the progress and the sacrifice that generations before them made. So I'm glad you brought the historical, importance of the records, because I think with family businesses that have the desire to perpetuate themselves generation after generation, they need to know the journey that their forefathers have walked. I think it's really
Absolutely. And I think, there's always a risk, and sometimes with Tata, they perhaps take it too far in the sense that they might be, I think, sometimes too obsessed with their own history at the expense of looking towards the future. But I think that on balance, most companies should do more of that, more of the looking backwards and really looking backwards with honesty and with perspective. And I think that's something that I can say, having worked in the Tata archives and having talked to lots of people in the Tata group. I think that they have, for a historian, they're a dream to study, because everyone wants to tell you about all the things that have happened before. So that's unusual and very satisfying.
I'd like to move on now to kind of the role of trusts and philanthropy. I think how businesses get owned, how they get structured, can determine the trajectory of their future and the possibility of them moving forward. And Tata has some pretty interesting structures that have been put in place. And we, in the news recently, we just saw the news about Patagonia and kind of how they're moving forward in their own structures. And so I wondered if you could give us a little bit of backdrop on Tata and kind of some of the trust structures that they put in place, and also how they're connected with philanthropy.
Yeah, and in some ways, the story of the Tata Trust starts with the idea of small families, right? It starts with the idea that, or the reality that Jamshedji's two sons didn't have children of their own. So already the succession crisis that could have happened doesn't happen, right? So they end up getting a kind of cousin, to come in to take over. But what happens to the shares of those two brothers, which are the controlling shares, 80% in the holding company, they take those shares and they put them in two trusts, the Dorabji and Ratanji trust. Today, those trusts own 66% of the shares of the main holding company. So it's slightly down from where it was in the 30s and 40s. This arrangement is not very common in the United States. It's more common among family businesses in Europe, and it differs by jurisdiction whether or not you can allow a charitable foundation to own your main controlling stake in your own in the company. But this is one aspect of Tata philanthropy that has been celebrated is the mere fact of this, right? So the mere structure of it, right? So in a way, this is what Patagonia is trying to do. This is where they are, right? They're in the step one of having made the decision, right, to put the company into this type of structure, into a nonprofit, right? So that's part one. But part two, what's really important about Tata philanthropy is that what those trusts did over the next 20 to 30 years. And so if all they had done was do kind of regular charitable donations, to either to religious institutions or to kind of poverty alleviation, these kind of very basic things that charitable giving tends to do in a place like India, I don't think they would have, had that longstanding reputation that they have. What those trusts did is they had a bold vision for providing India with different kinds of institutions that were necessary in the realms of science and in the realms of education and really India's development. So we're talking about everything from the Indian Institute of Science, which was the first higher education institution in India dedicated to science and technology. We're talking about a cancer hospital, India's first cancer hospital, India's first center for atomic and nuclear physics, a social science school that trained social workers and investigative kind of social problems modeled on the Russell Sage Foundation in New York, and all of these other types of initiative. Then eventually they did go into more kind of community development and village rural development programs later on. And now they do all sorts of NGO partnerships in India. But the Tata trusts have built a reputation of their own that really stands apart from what the company is doing. It's of course connected to what the company is doing, not least by the fact that the trusts own that company. But so when we're talking about, for example, Patagonia, I would be interested to, I think it's exciting what they're doing. I think more companies should consider doing something like that. But I also think that the results will be judged in, 5, 10, 20 years to see, what the agenda is going to be and how well this nonprofit is going to implement that agenda and how that's going to reflect back on the legacy of the company.
Yeah. So Jamshedji Tata talked about constructive philanthropy, which I thought was really interesting in the book. And it just talks about, says, what advances a nation or community is not so much to prop up the weakest and the most helpless members as to lift the best and most gifted to make them the greatest service to the country. I found that really interesting. I mean, kind of a little, but
well,
also
it was controversial.
It was very controversial. Yeah.
Yes. It was controversial because India was a poor country, and like I said, very community based. So many people wanted Tatas to give within the traditional networks of community and for those objectives of helping the neediest. But I think Tata saw that what India needed in a larger perspective was this kind of infrastructure that wasn't there, that the British rulers weren't providing and that Indians couldn't provide for themselves. I think today the situation is a little bit different. So I think that today sometimes the Tata trusts and Tata giving ends up being criticized, for example, for endowing a lot of buildings and programs at American universities rather than helping, Indian education. So that would be one example. So I think the situation is a little bit different today, but I think at the time this was seen as really farsighted and really innovative.
Fantastic. Very interesting. I also want to talk about, we've talked about a lot of men so far.
Yes, thank you.
And I wanted to get to, the role of and the influence of strong women. And there's a couple of fun stories in the book, and I wondered if you would just highlight those.
So in the crisis that I mentioned of the 1910s, 1920s, when they were losing all this money on commodity trades, word got around. So the Parsi community is very tight-knit. The whole business community in Bombay was very small and by global standards and very tight-knit. So word spread around pretty quickly that Tata's reputation for being prudent investors and reliable, profit makers that could be trusted was being damaged. And it was Dorabji, these are the two sons of Jamshedji, the sons of the founder. So it was Dorabji's wife, Meherbai, who herself was a very educated, very prominent woman in colonial India. She was a kind of suffragist and a feminist, and was very involved in philanthropy as well. But she was the one, her role in business is not as well known, but she was the one to come in and kind of alert the two brothers who were running the holding company that things weren't going well, and to kind of urge them to make that tough call, right? To maybe get rid of these other businesses or maybe reconsider the strategy. And 10 years later, there was another incident where the other brother's wife, Navajbai, she was the wife of Ratanji, she came in very strongly when the Tatas were considering selling the controlling stake in their hydroelectric power companies. Sorry, that was another big Tata invention I didn't mention. The first hydroelectric power generation system in India, built the first big dams. which later on became very important for India. But anyway, they're going to sell those companies to an American conglomerate. And Tata's whole claim was that they're serving the nation with this, with this electricity infrastructure. And then she was the one to say, you can't do this, right? You're going to sell out our nation and our identity. She was outvoted, but at the end of the day, they did take those companies back, at 20 years later. And so of all the people in those meetings, that again, you can't get this information, unless you go into those archives, unless you have those fine-grained stories, to really tell us what happened in these moments. And it was Navajbai who kind of stood up and made her voice heard. And I think that is once again, a reminder that overall, unfortunately, the role of women in Tata and many other businesses in South Asia, at least in the kind of modern period, is very limited, unfortunately, other than a few very isolated examples. But I think if we dig deep enough, we're going to find more of these stories that tell us about really the hidden role of women, both in terms of connecting and maintaining the Tata family's connection to other families and other wider community networks, but also in terms of business decisions. And they were there in the big moments and they made their voices heard.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those stories. Yeah, I think the women's role in companies like Tata is oftentimes underestimated and underdocumented, I would say, and many times with many multi-generational family businesses, it's a very similar story. I want to talk now about just some of the political tightrope walking that they had to do through the years, whether it was financing or tariffs, how they navigated the political landscape being a business of their size. Can you just give us some, I guess, some insight into some of the things they had to navigate?
Yeah, so there's a lot of scholarship nowadays, and there's an article I mentioned to you by Gareth Austin, Carlos Davila, and Jeffrey Jones at HBS called "The Alternative Business Histories in Emerging Markets," and they talk about one thing that businesses in emerging markets always have to worry about is politics, and they have to worry about it, they argue, more than businesses in markets with well-developed, legal systems and property protections and representative political systems that may have lobbying, of course, and may have all sorts of things going on. But the uncertainty, the existential uncertainty that a business in that context is going to face is much less than what the Tatas have faced. So they survived across the transition from British colonial rule. And remember, it wasn't just the British they had to deal with, but the Indian nationalists coming up. And for example, saying things like, you can't sell your company to an American company, even though that might bail you out, right? It might be in your business interest, but you can't do it because it's not in the national interest. So they navigate that tightrope. Then in the 1950s, you have a new government coming in, independent India, that wants the state, the government, to control a lot of the planning decisions precisely in those sectors that the Tatas are invested in. So in steel, in power, in these basic infrastructure. So they have to deal with that. And then nowadays, they have to deal with the kind of globalized, hyper-competitive globalized landscape where they need state support to be able to survive. So they have to deal with, in India today, there's a government that is kind of all powerful, right? So they have a huge electoral majority, they control a lot of the institutions, and they play favorites they certainly have their business groups that they favor. And this was true also in the previous regimes in India, where in that from 1950 to 1970, there was a different government in charge, different ideology, but they also had their favorite businessmen that were getting deals, were getting licenses, sometimes under the table. And so the Tatas in that period were able to keep their distance from this kind of thing and were able to navigate very deftly through these treacherous waters by at times playing ball and making deals, at other times kind of taking a stand, and they did suffer sometimes from those stands. They didn't get licenses for expansion for their plants. They didn't get, favorable, export licenses and things like that. And nowadays you have a similar situation where you see the Tatas being somewhat close to the ruling government, but not as close as other business groups. So in my opinion, having looked at this whole story from a bird's eye view, I think that being able to keep your distance as much as you can from whatever the ruling government of the day is, take the favors that you need to take, make the deals that you need to take, but ultimately don't get too attached to the ruling power, because when things change, you're going to have to pivot, right? And I think the Tatas offer a good lesson for many businesses who have to deal with this type of environment of how you can do that.
I wanted to ask one more question, and then I'd like to open it up to the Q&A. If you do have a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But we are at the Peter Drucker School of Management, and
Yes.
so I wanted to ask you, there seem to be some of Peter's fingerprints on Tata and maybe influencing maybe the later generations of leadership. Would you, I guess, speak to that?
Yeah, so part of the that moment of the 50s that I talked about creating that shared company culture, that a lot is not just about the history, but it's also about thinking about the role the corporation is going to play in a time in the 1950s as the Tatas saw it, because of the rise of this new government that really wasn't very friendly to private business. Their feeling was that we have to create a purpose for ourselves, a new purpose for ourselves, to serve the nation and to serve society, in addition to mere profit making, and also to modernize and update our management style and our management training for the complexities of running this expanding business group that's involved now in a lot of kind of high tech, for the time, industries, and a lot of technical knowledge is required, a lot of coordination. So this was the era of the big integrated managerial corporation in the US as well as in India. And so they turned to Drucker's ideas. They put Drucker on the syllabus of their management training school, and individual people within Tata. And that's something I didn't talk about today, but is really an important theme in the book, which is not just the family members, not just the top layer of corporate leadership, but the people right below them, who oftentimes are not only implementing a lot of this shared identity. So I'm talking about things like setting up conferences and workshops that bring people from across the group together to work out a strategy and to really address the problems of each company. That wasn't the top layer. It wasn't the chairman, and it wasn't the board doing that. It was these other people at that second layer of not quite middle management, but middle upper management, some of whom were members of the same community. Some of them were distantly related to the family. They're the ones that are really implementing this. And oftentimes, they're also the ones that bring exciting ideas to the attention of the group. So for example, here's what's going on in management thought in America. Here's Drucker. We should all read, The Concept of the Corporation, right? And that was a very influential book in particular for the Tatas. And Drucker's idea that the corporation is a kind of bedrock social institution was something that appealed in India a lot. I'm not going to say more than in the US, but it certainly appealed. It had a special kind of appeal there, because there was this question of, okay, what's the role of business going to be in this big political change that we have, and of course looking ahead to the future of India. And I think that Drucker's ideas were central to how the Tatas carved out that role for themselves into the 20th century and then down to the present.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to get to some of the questions in the chat, and then if there are people that afterwards want to ask questions, we can actually hear your voices if we'd like to. So first question comes from Steve Schrager. He asks, how did the Tata family go about vetting, grooming, and selecting future leaders for either a particular business or for the holding companies?
Fantastic question. I think the process was pretty ad hoc. I mean, one thing to note is that the Tatas had significant continuity of leadership at the top from, like I said, 1940 to 1990s. And then there was a succession dispute, a pretty serious one that people forget, in the early 90s when that longstanding chairman retired and then died soon after. So that was a case where Ratan Tata, who became the chairman from the 90s into the late 2010s, kind of won out of one of the heads of the company. So I think he wasn't, the most prominent head of the company. There were the head of Tata Steel, the head of Tata Hotels, of Tata Power. These were very important and very prominent CEOs in their own right in India. And they were associated with their companies and with the Tatas, but they kind of campaigned for that post on the basis of their reputation in the companies. And ultimately, Ratan Tata was chosen as a kind of left field choice. He was a family member by adoption, but he wasn't, one of the most prominent figures. He was known as a modernizer, as somebody who was he was educated in the U.S. and was trained as an architect and was interested in electronics and in the kind of consumer side of the business, looking in the future. And he had been tested, in some of these companies. He had turned around Tata Motors, their auto division. And in the end, that turned out to be a great bet. So it was a bitter succession battle, and there was some underhanded activity, but in the end, it turned out to be a good decision. In 2016, they went for Cyrus Mistry, who was not a member of the Tata family, a member of the Parsi community. He was part of the kind of inside-outside candidate. So he was part of a family that owned some shares in the main holding company, but not a Tata. And they came to regret that decision, rightly or wrongly. There was a succession dispute then to remove him and replace him with the former head of now Tata's biggest and most profitable company at TCS. So I would say that it's a small sample size, but most of the time it's worked. But then when it doesn't work, it can create some very serious problems. And I would say that crisis, dispute of 2016 to 2019, was probably one of the most damaging things for Tata's reputation that they're kind of recovering from now. So it's always been that debate between, do you hire somebody, do you hire the most prominent person that's running your businesses? Do you prioritize someone in the family or the community? Do you bring in an outsider, which they haven't done really? That's another option that was open to them. They preferred not to do that. So every time it happens, it's a nail-biting phenomenon.
For sure.
But what you don't have is disputes like in other big Indian corporate groups where you have two sons, like the Ambani family, where the two sons split up the business, and there was a lot of problems with that. So you do not have that in the Tata case.
And that's mostly because of the size of the family, correct?
Yes, but it's also because I think the culture, holds them together more than the Ambanis, which were first generation billionaires who I think the temptations were too great for them.
Got it. Okay. Another question in the chat, and we have just 5 minutes left here. This comes from Mercy. Is it still a trust or foundation structure that owns the family assets and wealth today?
Yes, it still is. And that is one of the aspects that makes Tata special and that does contribute to their reputation. So when people look at the Tata Trust, like I said, they don't just see, oh, this is the charitable organization of the Tatas. They see the Tata Trusts have their own identity and their own reputation that kind of enhances the reputation of the group, but that is separate from it.
Fantastic. If there are any other questions, again, feel free to put them in the chat. We're just coming close to the end of our time. I guess in closing, any big lessons learned that we haven't already covered? I know we kind of covered a lot of ground here. Things to learn from the Tata family and their experience that might help basically any family business of any size. Any takeaways there?
I mean, I think I would underscore the point that I kind of snuck in there, which is about thinking about that. I think when it comes to succession and things like that, it's going to be very dependent on the size of the company, on the culture that your company's developing in. So I think those lessons can't really be generalized very well. I do think that on this question of finding that second layer of trusted people that maybe aren't within the family, they're not within the innermost circle, but that can be out there, and those people that I mentioned, people like there's a fellow called Padsha and another one called Masani. These are people who had oftentimes connections to the outside world. They moved from the company to other organizations outside and back in, and they really connected Tata together and with what else was going and what was going on outside the group. So I think developing that layer of talent that is there, the people you can trust, but people who aren't fully within your kind of inner circle, that is going to be one key lesson. And that's really the balance they struck between professional management and family business. And the other one, I think, is looking to the past versus the future. I think you have to have a healthy balance of that. And I think that's been a challenge for the Tatas, and is, I think, a challenge for any business, especially family businesses that pride themselves on, for example, we've made watches or boots or whatever we've made for 100 years, and we take pride in the quality of our products in a local manufacturing. Or I'm just giving you some examples here off the top of my head, and then looking toward the future and to where you can innovate and where you can get ahead of your competition. So I think the Tatas have found that balance overall, if you look at the big picture, but they've also had a lot of challenges and a lot of tensions and conflicts with that. And so I obviously think that you shouldn't be too stuck in the past, but you also shouldn't be ready to shed and ready to move with the wind at a moment's notice. And I think people appreciate that about Tata. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to study them, is because this company means something to India. It means something to Indians, and now it means something to the world that is far greater than their balance sheet, right? And I think that if you can achieve that as a family business, that's going to be really great.
Fantastic. For those of you that haven't picked up the book yet, you need to get it. It's really fascinating. And Mircea, I really appreciate all the work that you put into the book, understanding the history and the story of really influential families and business owning families like the Tatas is really helpful. And so again, thank you for joining us today. And I'm just going to share my screen one more time, as a reminder that next month we will invite Jim Grubman, who wrote Strangers in Paradise: How Families Adapt to Wealth Across Generations. He'll be joining us on November 17th at 10 a.m. If you have any questions from today or would like to connect on any of the programs that we have coming up, feel free to reach out to me directly. Again, Professor Raianu, thank you so much
Thanks
for
very much.
sharing your time.
Thanks to all of you for coming this morning.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.